Thank you so much, Nuchi. I'm Bama Athreya, and I am a member of the Women's National Democratic Club and active on the GOTV committee with the excellent Mindy Burrell, who is leading that committee. Today's presentation and discussion is about the Hold the Line Guide. In addition to all the great things we're doing to get out the vote, we will also need to take some additional steps to protect the vote this year. And our speakers will be telling us how we can do that. Well, I do want to say, for those of you who aren't already active with our committee, we really urge you to get involved. We've got events just about every night going through October, including our very popular Winning Wednesdays, where you can phone, text, or write letters to voters in competitive states. And we are particularly targeting states where we can flip the Senate seats. And this Wednesday, we're going to Georgia, so it's not too late to sign up for tomorrow. So let me turn now to an introduction of our speakers, and I'll turn the floor over to them. Both of them, I should say, are co-authors of the Hold the Line Guide, and they are here in their personal capacities, not as representatives of their organization. All their work on the Hold the Line Guide has been as volunteers concerned with protecting our democracy. Kiffa Shah is a senior campaign manager at Empower Change, and her work spans multiple industries globally in education, economic empowerment, civic engagement, and the surveillance state. Hardy Merriman has worked in the field of nonviolent civil resistance for over 18 years, presenting, writing, leading workshops, grant making, and developing programs for practitioners and scholars around the world. A focus of his work is movements fighting for human rights and democracy against authoritarian rule. After the authors share remarks, we will be moderating a question and answer time with them. And for those who actually are ready to roll up their sleeves and put the guide into action, we are promoting 3 upcoming workshops for action planning based on the guide. And you can find the registration link for those in the announcement for this event on the WNDC site. Okay, and now thank you so much for joining us. Kiffa and Hardy, over to you.
Thank you, Bama, and thank you, Nuchi, for that warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here. And also thank you to Mindy Burrell for her work to make this event possible. It's great to be here, as I mentioned, and you know, I'll give a little bit of background about Hold the Line. In June 1st, which now seems like a long time ago, but of course, not really, we recall that President Trump ordered the military to clear demonstrators from Lafayette Park right outside the White House. And for those of us who authored Hold the Line, this was another just blatant abuse of power and proof and evidence of how far Trump would go to try to do what he wants, whether it's around the election or anything else. And so we came together, I think it was in the 3rd week of June, to talk about this and to take our skills and our experience and put it together and try to produce something that we felt could provide guidance for you know, an executive that is unconstrained, where institutions may not be enough to hold them accountable, particularly around this election. So we sought to apply lessons from, again, our own experience, but also from movements around the world that are fighting for democracy and human rights, looking at, you know, what are the lessons that we can learn from them and how can they apply in the United States. And what came from that, I think all of us are surprised to say, was the Hold the Line Guide. I seem to recall, Kiffa, in our early conversations, it was like we were thinking like 5 pages or something. And here we are with 53 pages, but that is a testament to 2 things. Number 1, change isn't easy, there is a lot to say. And number 2, when you work with others who are really exceptional and outstanding, you form a great team, you can go all kinds of places that you didn't even know you would end up in a really positive sense. So the guide has 4 parts. Part 1 is just about actions we can take between now and Election Day to try to ensure a successful election. A successful election is simply an election that works, regardless of outcome, an election where people can vote, it's safe, the mechanisms work. What can we do to ensure that? Part 2 goes into a number of scenarios that could take place after Election Day. And we've all read a variety of articles. Many of them are scary and anxiety provoking about what could go wrong. We distill those down, drawing from the Transition Integrity Project, into sort of 3 core scenarios, and we don't dwell too much in what could go wrong. We focus on what we can do about it, because actually there's a ton we can do about it. And we think that's actually the real power here, is saying we need clarity of action. We actually have a lot we can do to ensure that the election is protected. And so let's get to that. So part 3 provides a 4-step process for people forming their own election protection groups wherever they are. And then part 4 provides more lessons about pro-democracy movements around the world. So I'd love to pass to Kiffa now to talk about scenarios and anything else.
Thanks so much, Hardy. I was wondering if you wanted to also touch on this part specifically, or should I hop into it?
If you're willing.
Sure. Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Kiffa Shah, and I had the honor of co-writing this with Hardy, from whom I feel like I have learned a lot, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and such a historic organization. So a little bit of background on the 2 main sort of timelines that we want to pay a little bit of attention to is November 3rd to December 14th, where the focus will really be on local and state levels to ensure that the results are certified. And we'll get into this a little bit more later. And then the phase 2 part that we want to pay attention to in terms of the timeline that we're paying attention to is December 14th to January 20th, where we want to focus on the shift in federal government, or the transition. And so the scenarios that we outlined in the guide are 3. The 3 scenarios are that 1, on election day, the results might be unclear, but Trump may still declare victory. 2, the election results show significant irregularities and or signs of tampering, and yet Trump may declare victory. And then 3, Trump may lose the election, but still refuse to leave office. I'll go into what those scenarios are in more detail, but I'm going to pass it to Hardy first to talk a little bit more about the model of change that we really frame the guide on entirely, and the actions that people take. This is the model of change that we recommend people think through. Hardy?
Sure, thanks, Kiffa. So the model of change is based on civil resistance, which is what ordinary people do around the world when their institutions are failing them. We look at movements that use strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, and a range of acts of non-cooperation to try to hold power holders accountable and win their rights, freedom, and justice. And the way that civil resistance works is that it's based on the understanding of power, that power actually comes from consent and obedience. That when authoritarians or others are out of control, they still are dependent upon people to actually carry out their orders. And they're dependent on widespread relative passivity in society in order to do what they want to do. And they're very good at making people confused and passive. They overwhelm us with information. They try to make it seem like they're incredibly strong. They constantly do things that distract us. They do things that provoke us, that are very legitimate provocations. They're not just distractions, they're legitimate provocations. And yet still we have to think, okay, how can we, what do we need to focus on here? And I think we've all had that experience. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that leaders depend on consent and obedience and cooperation from thousands and millions of people within various institutions, whether they're governments or corporations, as well as the passivity of society in order to actually do what they want. And so that means that when people shift their behavior patterns in targeted and strategic ways, changing their economic patterns, their work or buying patterns, for example, changing their political behavior or their social behavior, they can actually shift the balance of power in society. And this sounds abstract. It sounds like I'm speaking like of a political theory, but it's actually very practical. And this has been used all over around the world. I mean, to just give one example, the president, longstanding autocrat in Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, last year fell because of a civil resistance movement that was sustained over months and led by women in that country. And so it's actually incredibly forceful. I don't think of civil resistance movements as pleading or petitioning. I think of them as demanding and actually forcing change frequently around the world, and especially against autocrats. So in addition, sometimes people think, well, perhaps it works, but perhaps it sounds a bit chaotic. But actually the opposite is true. So in this field of civil resistance, one of the most recurring findings over the last 10 years is the link between bottom-up grassroots pressure using nonviolent tactics and democratic change. Civil resistance movements again and again and again have been established by study after study after study to be, I would argue, the strongest driver of democracy in the world. And I mean, the strongest single driver and the strongest single force to challenge authoritarianism. So we actually know that what is true. And we've seen it, of course, in our own country. I don't need to, I mean, when we think about the women's suffrage movement, for example, how did they get access? It wasn't through voting. It was through civil resistance that led to recognition of their rights to vote. And we've seen it with labor rights, civil rights, the rights of marginalized populations, environmental protection and justice, and a range of other causes in US history. So that's what Hold the Line is based on. It's based on the idea that we can actually impose costs and make things really challenging non-violently, and that we have the power to win if we prepare to do that ahead of time if needed.
Thanks so much, Hardy.
Kiffa, I think, yeah, that's about it.
No, that was so inspiring, and I hope that everyone feels a little bit grounded in that idea of civil resistance being the model that we really want to carry through. Because now I'm going to go into a little bit about the scenarios that we might see, and I just want folks to keep in mind what Hardy was talking about, because like he said, there's so much that we can do, and we hold a lot of power from the bottom up. And so please keep that in mind as we go through these scenarios. So the first scenario that we might see is that on election day, the results are unclear and Trump declares victory anyway. That means that, you know, there might not be a clear winner on election night, since there's many ballots that still will need to be counted. But knowing that there will be a close margin and that the remaining votes will likely skew Democratic, it could cause confusion, especially if within the hours of the days after voting, they declare victory immediately. And so some of the other things that might cause more confusion are the possibility of foreign interference, especially online, and declarations of voter fraud, or investigations into voter fraud, even if there isn't really significant evidence of it. Courts might also stop counting ballots or even, you know, impound voting machines. And Republican-led states might also be pressured to not certify the results if Biden does win. All of this, of course, might also cause or lead to the threat of violence. And these are some of the things that we anticipate in this scenario that we might see. But let's talk a little bit about the opportunities that we'll also see during this moment that we need to consider. Of course, we have to make sure that every vote is counted and call for that at every level of government. We also would need to, as Hardy has been talking about, encourage people to engage in protests and nonviolent civil resistance, especially since anything other than that by the Trump administration would be sort of like an affirmation of his law and order stance, right? So we don't want to do anything to uplift his narrative or double down on his narrative. And then we also should elevate the voices and demands of local groups in contested states, especially those who are the most vulnerable and on the front lines. Some of the messaging reminders to think through here are that a slow election doesn't mean an inaccurate one. voting is safe, it's secure, and we can hold our officials accountable. And we also need to aggressively challenge in this scenario the idea of voter fraud in the media and at every level that we possibly can. The second scenario that we outline in the guide is that the election results will show significant irregularities or signs of tampering, but there still might be a victory that Trump claims. So we expect that what follows will be a lot of misinformation and campaigns by right-wing media or even foreign entities. And some of the irregularities that you might see might be delays in ballot counting and reporting, and then also that the numbers simply just won't add up. So the other expectation that we also have in this scenario is that federal, local, and state actors might interfere or take no action at all when it comes to upholding transparent forms of investigation. In this scenario, we again have to consider the possibility for violence and also, you know, actions that the military or the police might take against protesters. So what are the opportunities in this scenario? Some of the things that we really have to do in probably every scenario are that we need to support and normalize nonviolent protests in every way that we possibly can. That includes learning ourselves what the principles of nonviolent civil resistance are, and then also teaching people how to resist. We need to place pressure on our elected officials to support and conduct independent investigations, and especially at the local levels in battleground states. So if you know folks that are in battleground states, this is something to let them know immediately. And then we also will, you know, need to uplift and amplify Republicans who are calling for fair and transparent elections. And we'll need to have a unified front and work together, especially with other organizations who are already laying a lot of the groundwork for this type of these scenarios, which are Pure Fair Fight, Protect the Results, and of course, Choose Democracy. So the last scenario that we expect to see is that, you know, Biden might win and Trump would still try to remain in office. So if Trump refuses to leave office, that means that he and supportive media might really drive forward the narrative of voter fraud. And we know that this narrative has come up a lot, and it might also arise immediately in the hours and days after the polls close. So that means that the Biden campaign would actually have to prove a negative, which is that voter fraud didn't happen. And here we're also going to have to consider the threat of violence from entities that would, you know, would actually, that violence would serve Trump and the administration well here. Because again, you can, you know, the Trump administration could double down on the narrative of law and order. So a lot of the things that we see in this scenario might also mimic scenario one that we talked about. And that means that a lot of the opportunities we'll see will also mimic scenario one. We'll need to think about a strong united strategy here where election protection teams and nonprofits and just everyday people show public support for transparent election results. And we also need to prepare for a potentially long fight, because in this scenario, we will have, probably in every scenario, a lot of rapid response and urgent action being taken. But in this scenario, especially, we might need to think through the long-term fight. So the last thing that we also want to do in terms of messaging is maybe, and that we know that there are a lot of other things that could have potentially happened. But in the research, what came up over and over again were these things. And so that's why we've outlined them in this way. We also know that this can be perhaps really stressful or daunting to think about. But the intention is that we need to understand the possibilities so that we also know how we can act and carry forward. And that's actually what Hardy is going to go into a little bit more. So here's what we can do.
Great, thanks, Kiffa. So that's just to echo what Kippa said at the end. Obviously, that's overwhelming. I remember when we were writing about those scenarios, it wasn't even pleasant to write about them, let alone continue to review and edit that part of the document, right? It's incredibly stressful. It's stuff we'd rather not think about. And there are a few things that are really important to keep in mind. The first is that in any scenario where election results would be subverted, the normal rules apply to power, and that it depends actually on the obedience and passivity of lots of people, right? So it actually depends on people going along with it. And what we know, in part from research on movements against coups actually, is that in those moments, part of what helps people decide where they want to go, especially if they're in government, is trying to think, who do I think is going to win? Because being on the winning side seems like a safe choice. It's certainly not true of everyone in government. They may not like who they think is going to win, but a lot of times this perception of who do we think might win is actually pretty important in sort of determining which way people might go. So what that means is that it's really important now to show that we're organized and that we are going to challenge any attempts to subvert the election, so that people say, oh, if he tries to do it, he may not get away with it. Because when people start to doubt, oh, he may not get away with it, that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That can become a virtuous cycle, we say, where people start to gain confidence. He's not going to get away with it. I see people standing against it. He's not going to get away with it. Now we're going to join them. Now, people within the system might consider where their self-interest lies, and if they think he's not going to get away with it, maybe they start to shift. And we've seen this dynamic play out many times. So the important thing is preparation, right? And so in Hold the Line, we talk in part 3 about election protection groups. And you don't have to be an expert to set these up. You don't have to be a seasoned activist. In fact, there are plenty of great folks, there are plenty of great activists who I think don't even use that term to describe themselves. What's important is to simply gather even just one or maybe several people in your community and talk through the scenarios. What would this look like in our community? What could we do? And after that, you start to map who are the power holders who would be important in any of these scenarios, from county clerk to secretary of state to governor to you name it. And we also encourage people to think also about the role of their police. For example, if there's going to be protests, then what police do matters. So maybe it's time now to start calling on police to reaffirm their commitment to protect the Constitution, particularly First Amendment rights to protest, and to protect protesters from armed groups who may show up to confront them. This may not be a problem in some places, but we know it probably will be a problem in others. So to start moving now with simple demands to electeds, ensure that every vote is counted. Can you commit publicly now that every vote will be counted, that irregularities will be investigated, and that the results will be respected, and you will take every action within your power and authority to do that. To police, again, requesting that reaffirmation. These are the things that actually you can do in your community with just even a few people in the next 27 days that can do a few things. Number one, it can get you organizing together, which is great. Number two, for a lot of folks, it will cause them to have greater familiarity with the range of important folks in the power structure who would play a really important role in any kind of election subversion scenario, either positive role or negative role. And the third thing that it does is it starts to set the narrative and pushes back against this constant sense of inevitability that Trump tries to create. We're not going to accept it. We're not going to accept attempts to subvert the results. We are organized and we're ready. And so those are 3 real values to this. Going further, the guide does have guidance on, for example, if you want to plan nonviolent tactics, everything from protest to petitions to non-cooperation, you name it, civil disobedience. And there are a lot of other resources you can find as well on that online, and we point to a few. And so these are, and then this 4th step is sort of continuing to watch, continuing to follow events, additional planning as needed. So these are some steps that we have in the guide. And I think with that, I mean, Kippa, would you add anything?
No, I think that was perfect. One thing that we do encourage folks to do in the guide is to create their own Hold the Line teams. So like Hardy was mentioning, there's so many things that people can begin to do immediately. And we do outline those steps in the guide. Plus, everybody's going to play a different role. I'm sure everyone here is already doing a lot to register their communities to vote and to make sure that people know how to get to the polls or vote safely right now in COVID-19 times. But encourage people to become poll workers, encourage people to create their own hold the line teams or election protection teams, and to really read through the guide and think through the steps that they can take within their spheres of influence, because there's a lot that each of us can do to prevent or to protect the results, to prevent the scenarios that we're talking about. And the last thing that I do want to encourage folks to do is to follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. We're putting out a lot of information, and if you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at defend@holdtheline.com. And I think that folks have been dropping different links in the chat, and thank you so much, Bama, for dropping our training tomorrow that's taking place at 7:30. Oh, wait. Tomorrow is another training that the link has not been dropped yet, but I will drop the link. But there's another workshop that Bama is talking about that's happening on Thursday. There's a link for, and yes, there's a Protect the Results national briefing call that is also taking place that we encourage folks to, and I will drop a link for our trainings that are beginning this week as well. And we hope that you can share it with folks. And those trainings will really allow people to think through how they can create their own hold the line teams and what are the tactics that they can start to sort of take, make moves around immediately.
Great, thank you both so much. And I have invited people to put some questions into the chat because we do have time for a question and answer with the speakers. I see one question there already, and I have one of my own, but let me start with the question that I'm seeing in the chat. And then, again, please keep posting the chat. You can also use the hand raise function if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, but please use the hand raise function first so I can keep a list of speakers in order. And as I can see, we're also continuing to post links to trainings in the chat. So, do go there and copy those links so you can keep them for future efforts. So the question is, the Supreme Court yesterday upheld a voter suppression case in South Carolina. And it was, with respect to absentee ballots and the need to have an additional witness on absentee ballots. So the question is, if the hijacking of the election reaches the Supreme Court and we end up with a Bush v. Gore type result, what do you recommend doing?
Well, I was going to ask Kiva to answer that, but that's a toughie. I think a few thoughts. The first is that we had that very conversation, versions of it, but I think, for all of us, I know for all of us, we came out on the side of, this guide is not a guide to try to undo an election result that we don't like, even if it's informed by a court decision that is defective. We have to, the premise of the guide is that we need the results of the election respected. We understand the system isn't perfect. We would be the first to acknowledge that democracy in this country, the way it's practiced and judicial decisions are not perfect, have not been perfect, and sometimes are deeply problematic. Our view, though, with the guide is this is about defending democracy, in a sense to the letter, in a sense to yes, to where that goes. I think 2 points. The Montgomery bus boycotts in 1956 actually ended with a Supreme Court decision. And I'm not sure, in fact, I'm fairly sure that the Supreme Court would have ruled differently if there hadn't been bus boycotts to begin with. In 2004, the Ukrainian Supreme Court actually reversed itself, or I don't know if it was the Supreme Court or the highest electoral court. I don't want to get to the exact name of the court. It was the High Court in Ukraine that was ruling on whether they would do a new election after, based on allegations of fraud. And it was really interesting how this court switched its view on that very fact when lots of people showed up and how determined they were to, frankly, like just withdraw consent completely until that election happened. And so the court, you know, political and judicial and legal institutions do what they do, and we do what we do. And my reading of history, both in this country and outside, is that what we do matters across all institutions. The last point I would say is that if you start an election protection team, that can be used for many purposes afterwards. There is nothing to prevent you from using that very structure and those associations you made to support human rights, to support accountability of the executive in other ways, and to support a whole bunch of other goals that can make this country better.
Great, thanks. I am going to jump in with my question since I don't see any other questions yet. I do encourage people to type questions in the chat, or if you want to be unmuted, just type question and I will call on you. Look, I noticed that as you went through the scenarios, one of the common themes in all three scenarios is this whole false narrative about voter fraud, and really, you know, drilling down on that narrative and using it and even seeing it amplified in mainstream media. There are allegations of voter fraud, which puts us on the defensive, right? It puts us on the back foot. So I wonder if you both have any thinking about, you know, what consistent with the actions that we need to take and really sort of getting people motivated to take those actions. What are some specific things we can do to just really sort of take ourselves out of that narrative about voter fraud?
I think that's a really great question, because I think one thing that points to for me is that where do I begin, right? And I don't see us necessarily on the defensive. I think that the reason why we're having this conversation today is just to do as much as we can as immediately as possible to ensure that, you know, we're having free, fair, transparent elections. I think one of the things that folks can probably do, and we listed it on, you know, the slide, you saw that, you know, register to vote. Make sure everyone that you know is voting. Everybody has a vote plan. If you can, and if you're able to, be a poll worker. If not, then, you know, again, the guide outlines, and many other folks are talking about how they need to create teams very locally so that they can start pressuring, like Hardy was talking about. What are the demands that we can immediately start to sort of put on our elected officials, on local institutions, local law enforcement, to make sure that, you know, at every step of the way, election results are going to be protected. I think in that sense, you know, the idea of voter fraud, we might be, I don't see that as necessarily set in stone. I think of that as a foreshadowing, right? He's like, the Trump administration and a lot of the media has already laid grounds for us to think that the elections will not be fair and will not be protected. And then, you know, what does it mean for all of us as everyday people or as activists to really say, actually, you know, we've already done all of these things to ensure that this is happening. You know, oh, you're talking about Charleston, South Carolina. Well, I already have a team of people, 5 people who have done the X, Y, and Z, you know, since the last month. And these are the ways that we've ensured that this is a transparent process. I think what we can do right now is really going to allow us to actually be not on the defensive, but well prepared for what might transpire. And I'm not saying that, you know, that means that we're solving for it all right now. I'm saying that there's very specific, concrete things, especially in the guide, and also what Hardy has been mentioning, right? Like, who are your local officials that you can contact, that you can say, are you going to uphold that every vote will be counted? Are you going to ensure that there will not be any sort of victory declared until every vote is counted? Are you going to make sure that polls are accessible, that, you know, there isn't suppression actively happening? You know, what are the things that we can demand of folks right now at a local level to make sure that there isn't, you know, this idea of voter fraud that even can exist within our own communities? I'm going to let Hardy answer too, if you'd like to, Hardy.
Thank you, Kiffa. And I agree with everything you said. And I would just add one more point. He's going to say what he's going to say no matter what. Every movement that I've looked at pushing for democracy gets accused of being a coup attempt, gets accused of being outside driven, gets accused of being illegal, sometimes gets accused of being terrorist, even if they're nonviolent. So we expect it. We expect it. He behaves like an autocrat. He has behaved like an autocrat. That's what he's going to do. And the question really is, how organized are we? Because he'll throw what he throws. And he'll, you know, but the question really again is, how much can we impose costs on behavior that we don't like? Economic, social, and political costs through civil resistance, through being targeted, through being organized, and through being able to move quickly, because things are gonna move quickly after the election, which means that in 27 days, may not seem like a lot of time, there's still a good amount of preparation we can do now for that. And it's complementary to all the kinds of civic mobilization you do anyway to get out the vote and make sure that this is a successful election.
Okay, great. So we've got some more questions coming in now. And one of them from Mindy is, I think, one that's on a lot of people's minds, and that is that we seem to have some spoilers who are provoking violence at some of the peaceful protests that have happened recently. How do we address this now in advance of the kind of peaceful actions that we might need to take, so that we can maybe forestall some of that? And also, if there is an incident of spoiler-caused violence, how should we react?
One thing that we have within the guide is a set of principles that people need to sign on to in order to be part of an election protection group or a Hold the Line team. I think that it's really important for everyone to be aligned on principles. So if you and your, local community start to take action, it's always a really good idea to take time to have a conversation around what those principles that you all are going to actually abide by are. And so I think one way to think through that is, say you're actually creating a team of your own, have a set of principles that everybody must sign on to and uphold. If not, then they're not folks that you work with. And then also, like, I think I really appreciate what you just said in terms of, the administration is going to say what it's going to say, and people are going to do what they're going to do. There's going to be a lot of room for chaos, but everybody needs to just stay focused and do as much as they possibly can, because we're not going to be able to, again, solve for everything, but we can think about, okay, here's what's right in front of us, and here's what my community needs, and then address that as immediately and as best as possible. And I think that, again, having a set of principles that you all sign on to is really important. Check out the guide for the principles that we've outlined, but also we can't necessarily, stop people from doing what they're doing, but we can form very strong movements that are nonviolent. And Hardy's talked about several examples now that we can look to for how that's happened. But, not to kind of get lost in the sauce of the chaos. So just stay focused.
So I'm going to throw in there was a second question that sort of piggybacked on Mindy's from Steve, and which is, what do you do if we have reached that point, we've mobilized people, and we actually see people on our side that are starting to respond with violence because things are getting crazy? What are some things we can do? So I'm going to take that, and then Steve had another sort of more strategic question, but since this builds on Mindy's, why don't you take that first, and then we'll come back to the other question.
Okay. Violence plays into Trump's hands. He will try to provoke it whenever he can. We've already seen this. We know it's going to happen because that's the turf he's comfortable in. And when violence happens, what he attempts to do is take a broad-scale nonviolent dissent, paint them with a broad brush that they're all violent, then try to shore up his support within the government institutions and police and military that those people are bad, and then try to do a crackdown. And he also tries to confuse the middle, so the middle's not quite sure which way to go. So this is a dynamic we know he will try to do. And so, authoritarians aren't the most creative people in the world. And I want to be clear, when I call Trump an authoritarian, I'm not saying we have an authoritarian system of governance in the United States. I'm talking about a personality that simply doesn't constrain itself and hasn't constrained itself. So it's incredibly important to remain nonviolent, because what that does is it creates an asymmetric conflict, a conflict where he actually doesn't know how to win, because violence against nonviolent demonstrators generally backfires. It generally heightens mobilization, and it's actually leads to more defections from within the government, of people saying, this is not what I signed up for, this is not right. So he would like it to move to violence. So a few things on dealing with violence. The first, as Kiffa said, principles, codes of conduct, really, really important. There's a difference between saying, we're calling for a protest, let's do this, versus we're calling for a nonviolent protest, the way we do things is nonviolent, and that's what we're committed to here. And that might seem minor, but it's actually really significant in a case like this, because that means that if people show up at that protest who may be provocateurs, who may well not support us at all and pretend to be protesters, and start engaging in violence, we've already inoculated ourselves. We've already said, look, we've already said by definition, this is how we work. We do not know who these people are. They do not represent us. It's clear, you've seen our statements consistently, that is not us. We don't know who that is. And so that's one thing. Training is really important, and training does not need to be something that requires days of work. Even basic orientation and onboarding of people into your election protection groups can involve, like, do you agree with these principles? This is a prerequisite. Here's why we remain nonviolent. We remain nonviolent because we think in this case it's the most effective strategy to win. We understand some people may differ, and we don't want to get into judging people morally on one view or another right now. We're here talking about what we think is going to be effective in stopping subversion of democracy. And the last thing is that at Actions, you can have nonviolent marshals. It can be a role, actually, that people can train for and play. At Public Actions, I am the person who tries to de-escalate, for example. I am the person who is trained, and there are actually peace team and nonviolent marshal resources online if you're interested in playing that really important role.
Great. I think that gets to part of the rest of the question as well, which was how can ordinary people step up and stick to thoughtful strategy? And I think you did a great job of answering that. The other part of that question, though, because it's sort of, there was a lot wrapped in there, was what about strategy across the landscape, and how do we need to think about a response that coordinates the many actors that need to be involved?
My initial reaction to that is that, and this might be controversial, I don't know how you feel about it, Hardy, but is that we don't really need to think about how the whole will respond. I don't think that, I think that that's a lot to, to bite off and try to chew. It's okay to first think, again, very immediately about who are the people that I can get involved that are in my immediate vicinity or in my community who want to create a team to protect the elections and protect the results. What is the way that I can make this process as transparent as possible, and how can I make it so that people want to get involved and create kind of a groundswell from where you are already. I want to just sort of affirm for people that a lot of people are thinking about this. There are national organizations and teams of people that are already forming. And so you're in good company. You don't necessarily need to think through, well, how are we going to have a coordinated strategy, and what if that, I promise you that's not necessarily going to motivate folks. So one of the best things that, we can do right now is bite off as much as we can chew and take it really one day at a time, and know that, there are less than 30 days now. So whatever we do, we need to do it immediately, and we need to start and act now. And know that you might have only 3 people who are on your Hold the Line team and your election protection team. But know that what you're doing right now is, again, laying a groundwork that will be necessary perhaps when polls close. And you might have a lot more people that join you, but you're going to have a great grounding for where they can start to plug in immediately. I think that that's one of the things that people are not necessarily keeping in mind, right? Is that if you're starting to act right now, you might be building towards something that will actually just quickly escalate. And then you're going to be the person and the that a lot of others are going to turn to know what to do next, right? And you'll be prepared. Ready?
Yes, I love it. Given the moment, don't aim for perfect, aim for good enough. We're all for coordination when it comes easily and those relationships of trust are there. But at 27 days, give it a shot. When we lack confidence, we tend to look for others to give us permission and enable us and legitimize what we're trying to do. You may not have that luxury. you may just have to create that infrastructure where you are. And if you do it thoughtfully, it's going to be good enough. If you bring your talents and your relationships that you have to it, it's going to be good enough.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to throw another one in because I don't see anything immediately in the queue. And that is, I asked about this whole disinformation and claiming voter fraud. I think the other thing that I'm observing with some of the grassroots groups that I'm in touch with is just confusion, because, and I think that's been a very successful strategy as well. Like, what happens if we've prepared and, we've formed our, kind of coalitions on the ground and we're ready to move, but there's just not clarity as to whether the response is called for or not, and at what guidance can you give as to when people need to think about when to go into action if there's just an unclear result or there's legal confusion?
I think that's a really great question, because something that I'm hearing is, how do we know when to act or when to take, when to sort of, enact a certain type of tactic, right? And I think, again, like in the guide, something that we talk about are what are the red lines, like what are the lines that we need to hold, what are the red flags that might be raised, right? So one thing that I think is really important that Hardy sort of touched upon is that when you start to do sort of power mapping and thinking through who are the power holders that we really need to hold accountable, that also allows you to see, the timeline of when, right? So in the very first slide, I can pop it up again, but we sort of talked about what are the time periods that are going to be important to consider as we get closer to the election. And those two for me, I think as an organizer, you should always think through what are the things that make most sense to you at a very local level, right? So if from now until election day, there are already a lot of irregularities that you see, I'm seeing all of a sudden that there are not as many polling locations in my community, or I'm seeing that there's a lot of pamphlets being distributed that are not actually for absentee ballots and just a lot of propaganda, and then inside of it, it's actually your actual absentee ballot. These are things that we know that are happening. So I think, the tactics that you use are going to be according to the issues that you're solving for at a very local level. Right? And then when to solve for it is because you see it happening, right? So I think that the timeline that you need to also implement is according to, again, we're only, 27 days away from the election, and a lot of people don't even know that this is their ballot because it just looks like propaganda, right? And so what can you do immediately in terms of messaging, in terms of outreach, in the very, short term to solve for that? And then the other thing is that if you start to, let's say like you know that you need to then hold certain power holders accountable, the tactics that you use for different issues will be different along the way. And I want to just like emphasize, because things are going to shift so quickly over the next few weeks, because there's going to be a lot of things that arise, it's okay to also have sort of like a list of different people and power holders that you need to hold accountable, and different sets of strategies and timelines for them, right? We just have to be very organized and also be prepared for things to move very quickly, and to know that there will be a lot to address. So kind of to focus in on where what needs to be solved for as immediately as possible. I hope that's a little helpful. I know that that's a lot to think through, but again, if you go through the guide, the steps that we outline about what are your spheres of influence, who are the power holders that you're immediately in contact with, who are the people that you can bring in that have relationships to power holders, and how can they also facilitate? You don't have to be the only one that pushes this through, right? You don't have to be the only one that's going to act on these tactics. Who are the people that you can bring in and can also help you move on these timelines and across these tactics with these power holders?
Great. And it sounds like some of what you're saying is there's always something to be done, even if you're not sort of taking it all the way to, your end point of action, that there's probably somewhere along that spectrum that we all need to be as well in terms of taking action. Hardy, do you want to add anything to that?
Nothing to add. I mean,
Okay,
just basically we're trying to build flexible capacity now. We don't know exactly where lightning's going to strike, but if you build that capacity now, you're going to be more ready if it strikes near you.
Okay. There's another question that's come in from Laura, which is an interesting one, which is, I mean, are obviously we're preparing for worst case scenarios, but is there a scenario under which you can imagine that Trump loses and concedes without incident? And if so, are there still things that we need to be prepared for?
I mean, I guess I could imagine it. But I mean, here's the thing. So what's the probability? Is it 90%? Is it 10%? Regardless, like what we're like, if there's a 10, even just like we have to accept there's a 10% chance that we lose our democracy this election, we have to prepare like crazy, right? So sure, I suppose he could concede, but I mean, here's how I've seen other autocrats concede. Okay, Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia conceded because he said he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren. He did that after a nonviolent movement basically made his rule impossible. In fact, he was giving orders to repress crowds that police weren't following. One police officer later said, "My children could have been in that crowd. I wasn't going to do anything." Augusto Pinochet in 1988 in Chile conceded defeat in a plebiscite after his Air Force, the head of his Air Force, walked out and congratulated the opposition publicly on their victory after people mobilized. So the question is not like, what does he want to do? The question is, what's the pressure on him, forcing him to do one thing or another? So I don't know what he's going to do. I simply know that what we have to do is create pressure that limits or constrains what he otherwise might try to do if indeed he attempts to subvert the election.
Great. Okay, we're almost at the hour, so I might just see if you have any final words and then turn it back to Nuchi to just close us out for today.
Thank you so much. This has been really so useful. We're constantly being approached by people asking us what we should do. And I'm going to recommend that if you don't mind, that we actually decimate your the information on your presentation to everybody on our email list, not just our members, because this is really important information. And we have like 7,000 people on our email list. I think everybody needs to, because we didn't have that many people on this program, and one way to rectify is to open it up to everybody on our list. So this has been really useful. We're keeping our fingers crossed, and thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Bama. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the participants.